Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Super excited to be back with you. We're here for the continuation of the Kentucky Court Interpreter Orientation. I am, of course, your host, Joshua Elliott, with my wonderful co-presenter, Armada Liste Gonzalez. Armada, say hello.
Hello, everybody. Hello. I was going to say good morning, but I don't know when you guys will be watching this, so let's just leave it at hello.
Let's just say it's morning for us. It's nice and early. We like to get started. You know how
That-
it is.
That's
Um,
right.
So I'm the executive officer of something called the Office of Language Access. Marta is the operations manager of that same department. We work very closely together to provide services to all of Kentucky's courts, all 120 counties. We send interpreters everywhere. Right now, of course, we're working virtually, which is why we're coming to you virtually, remotely, with this orientation for new court interpreters. This is the second presentation that we're offering. So let's jump in and get started. Of course, last time we did an overview of the Kentucky judicial system. We are now going to talk a little bit about Court Interpreting 101. We now know what the courts are. We understand how information moves through the courts, how a case starts and how it ends, and how the interpreter acts or reacts or interacts with all of those processes along the way. Having said that, now I think we need to define court interpreting a little bit. So in today's session, we're going to talk about, let me go back here. We're going to talk about what is court interpreting. We're actually going to define it, right? We'll talk a little bit about what it is and perhaps what it's not, which is really important. We're going to talk about why the courts pay for interpreter services. Is it just out of the kindness of our hearts, or is there a legal reason why we actually exist? That'll be an interesting conversation. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between interpretation and translation. And I imagine this will be eye-opening for some of our participants. We sort of use those words interchangeably, but are they really the same, or is there a difference? Let's define that a little bit. We'll talk, of course, about being bilingual and is it enough? Later, we'll talk about how bilingual do you have to be, but let's at least start that conversation now and talk about the bilingual skills you need, and is being bilingual simply enough? Let's also talk a little bit about what a court interpreter actually does. You know, after we define the job itself, let's get into the nuts and bolts. Let's talk about what that court interpreter may actually do while he or she is plying his or her trade in court. What does that look like, right? And then we're going to end just very briefly with the three modes of interpretation. I at least want to mention them. We're not going to go into detail today, but I at least want to make sure that we understand what they are. So without further ado, let's get started. Let me mention up front as well before we go forward, this is a virtual format. This is really one of the first times Armada and I are doing a full orientation this way. There could potentially be issues. We understand that. Just roll with the punches with us. Give us some grace if things don't quite work out right. If we don't say quite the right thing, we'll fix it and we'll go back. But I feel like we can give you some really high quality information and have some fun along the way as we do so. So just hang with us. Nothing's perfect in life, but we'll try to get as close as possible. Let's move forward. So first, I want to define what court interpreting actually is. So let's just go through it. I'm going to read through this slide. There's a lot of good information here to unpack. So court interpretation is the act of orally transferring meaning from one language to another in a variety of judicial proceedings through the use of various interpretation modes. Court interpreters are expected to convey every element of meaning of the source language message without adding, omitting, editing, simplifying, or embellishing. We're going to unpack that in just a moment. But I mean, if I had to summarize this for you, I guess what we would understand is just that, hey, we say everything that's said, no more, no less. I mean, it's easy, right? That's what it sounds like. I just got to say what they say. They say this, and I just spit it out in the other language. It's easy. I don't change it. I don't make it sound better. I don't make it sound worse. That'd definitely be bad. I don't leave stuff out. I just say what they say. It's so easy. So easy, but yet so difficult. You can spend a lifetime trying to perfect this art, I imagine. And it is an art. It's more of an art than it is a science. There's usually not a one-for-one equivalent. Keep that in mind. It's not usually that they say this and I always say this. No, there are all these nuances, and the interpreter has to use context in order to find the right interpretation. We'll talk more about that later in the orientation. So let's go back a little bit through the definition here. Just a couple of things I think we need to clarify. So court interpretation, it is an oral activity. So typically when we talk about interpreting, we're talking about something that happens out loud, right? Um, it wouldn't be something that we would necessarily do in writing or via the written word. We'll talk more about that in a few slides, so keep that in mind. When we talk about transferring meaning here, we're specifically referring to transferring from English into a foreign language and also from the foreign language into English. It can go both ways. It's not one directional, right? So depending upon who is speaking, we'll be processing the information in one language and then ultimately producing the interpretation in the other language. And that can change. It can change very rapidly, and interpreters have to go back and forth. Now, we talk here about a variety of judicial proceedings. As you guys remember from the overview of the Kentucky judicial system, interpreters interact with the judicial system in numerous ways, in numerous settings. In all of those settings, we would be doing court interpreting, of course, and they vary greatly. It could be a traffic ticket, it could be an adoption, it could be a jury trial, it could be a sentencing for the death penalty. It just varies greatly. On any given day, you never know what you're going to get. And that's the beauty of this profession. We do use different interpreting modes of interpreting. We'll talk about those in just a little while. That really refers to the way that we provide services, right? You don't go in and just sort of say stuff. There are specific ways, specific modes that you will actually interpret. And so we'll talk about those just a little bit. And later in the orientation, we will show you how those are done and we'll really get into detail. Now, maybe the most important part of this definition is at the end when we talk about conveying every element of meaning. You know, in different types of interpreting, there are different standards for accuracy. Sometimes it's okay to summarize in other types of interpreting. So depending on what I'm doing, it may be fine for me to summarize. It may be fine for me to make the message less complex depending upon my audience. I may be able to paraphrase. I may be able to make things sound better, make the speaker sound more eloquent than he or she really is. Other types of interpreting, those are tools that I may have at my disposal. In court interpreting, however, it's not that way. In court interpreting, I have to say, like we said before, I have to say exactly what is said, no more, no less, the way it's said. And I have to maintain tone and maintain register. And we'll talk more about those terms a little bit later. I must not add anything, put stuff there that's not really there. I may not omit anything, means I can't leave it out. Most errors that are made in court interpreting are omissions. We leave it out. Leave it out because we forgot or because we didn't know what the word was. We can't edit. That means I can't, change the content. I can't give my opinion on it. I can't simplify it. I can't make it sound easier than it really is. If they're using complex language, it's got to be complex. That's maintaining a register. And we certainly can't embellish, can't make it worse than it is, can't make it sound better than it is, right? That's what court interpreting is in a nutshell. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So in other words, court interpreters must maintain the tone and register of the original message, even if it's inappropriate, offensive, or unintelligible. So we just mentioned those terms, tone and register. Let's talk a little bit about what that means now, what both of them mean. So tone relates to the emotion of the interpretation, or maybe of the original message that you're hearing, right? There's a big difference between these versions of the same word. Listen up. Did you do it? No. 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 Right? There's a big difference all the way. That I was able to relay different meaning just by changing the tone. As court interpreters, we have to maintain that tone, at least to some degree. We have to be careful because something that's not funny can sound very funny if I'm copying exactly what the person is saying. But there should be some emotion in our interpretations, and we'll talk about that a little bit more down the line. So we have to maintain tone, and we also must maintain register. Register deals with the formality of the message. So if you have a judge who is using highfalutin legal language, your interpretation should also sound pretty highfalutin. It should sound like legalese in the other language, right? We have to maintain that register, the formality of the language. So if he says something like this, let's say the judge says something like, "Sir, you are hereby remanded to the county detention center for a period of no less than 30 days. Okay. And I turn to the guy and I say, "Dude, you're going to the slammer for a month." Well, same meaning. Yes, I did tell him what was said, but I drastically changed the tone, right? I really brought it down. I took the tone down to sort of, this street slangy level, not appropriate in court interpreting. We have to maintain it. So I have to make sure that my vocabulary is very well developed. And this is true. Tone and register is something that's required, even if it's inappropriate, offensive, or unintelligible. What do I mean by inappropriate? Joshua, are you telling me you might have to curse in court? That court interpreters cuss sometimes? Well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've actually had people come through our orientations, and they stopped after the orientation because they were really uncomfortable with this. And I understand that, and I respect that. What I would say on the other side of that is this is a part of the job. You got to remember, we're dealing with crime. We're dealing with people who commit lots of crime at times. And sometimes these people have very colorful language. And we as court interpreters are tasked with maintaining tone and register, underlying message, no matter what is said. So if they say, Judge, you're a wonderful person, it's great to be here, and I plead guilty. Well, we would say it just like that. But if they happen to say, Judge, fuck you, Judge, fuck you and your mama. Well, I also have to say that. That's just sort of the way that the game is played. And actually, interpreting slang, interpreting bad words can be very technical. It requires much study. If you're uncomfortable with this up front, I think now is a good time to sort of reconsider going forward. All right, but it's important. So inappropriate, offensive, unintelligible, if they're not making any sense, you still got to say it. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes people are lying and they're putting things together. Doesn't make sense. Sometimes they're literally not mentally stable, and therefore their thoughts are not coherent. Doesn't make sense. That's important. It's important that we main all of these things, right? Because based on our interpretation, the judge, the jury will perceive that person in a certain way. And if we're not careful, we can change the perception that that judge has or that the jury has of that person. And they could maybe make a different decision in the case based on our faulty interpretation because we didn't maintain the message, didn't maintain tone and register. Very important. So when we talk about what accuracy means, and we're going to get into accuracy a whole lot a little bit later in another presentation. But really what we're talking about here is making sure that the interpretation is true to the actual meaning of what's being said. Court interpreters throughout their careers, I would say, but especially at the beginning, they tend to focus a whole lot on words. What's the word for this? How do I say this word and how do I get it in this language with this word? Don't get me wrong, words are important. I want you to look up the words. But we don't really deal with words. That's not really what we do when we interpret in court. We're dealing with concepts. We're dealing with underlying meaning. And there are many, many ways to say things, to relay concepts using different words, right? And many of those could be correct interpretations. Even if you don't have the correct word, you potentially could come up with a correct interpretation because ultimately that concept, we should be able to maintain that in the other language. Now, I want you to go back later. If this happens to you, I want you to go back and look up the word. I do want you to learn the word. But you have other tools at your disposal when we're interpreting because really what we're dealing with is concept. So it's concept for concept, meaning for meaning. Words really are just symbols that convey ideas. And remember that our interpretation is there. We exist to convey the idea stated in the original language in the same style, tone, intent used by the speaker. So get away from the word itself, right? I want you to have a great vocabulary and learn those, but I want you to really realize that we deal with meaning, we deal with concepts. That's very important up front. That's why we mention it so early in the orientation process, right? So let's give an example. This is going to be shocking, I imagine, for some that are listening, but this is important. So if the defendant is an illiterate hermit from a geographically isolated region of a distant and remote country, he or she should understand as much of the message as an illiterate and geographically isolated resident from the United States. What does this mean? So you're interpreting, you're looking at the guy doesn't understand. Do we have an obligation to make the guy understand? Well, the interpreter's job, remember this, is to place the non-English speaker on an equal footing with, not at an advantage relative to, an average layperson who understands ordinary English. So is it possible, if I'm interpreting in court, like we talked about before, the judge is using, very complex language, some legalese stuff. The person I'm interpreting for, it's not that this person is uneducated or not intelligent. It's just, hey, they're in a court in the United States for the first time. They're talking about weird concepts that this person's never heard. I mean, it could be a little bit complex to understand, right? And I'm looking out of the corner of my eye and I'm seeing that this person obviously doesn't understand. You can tell by their body language and on their face, right? The expression they have on their face. It's obvious to me. Wouldn't I have some responsibility to make sure that that person understands? Shouldn't I stop? Judge, I don't think he understood what you meant with that word. Would you give the interpreter permission to lower the register? Judge, could the interpreter have a moment to explain? Do I have any role as an interpreter in that process? Well, not according to this, right? Because think about it. If there were an English speaker in court, is it possible that that English speaker could leave court without having understood everything that happened? Yeah, even very educated English speakers who have grown up in the United States their entire lives, right? They come in and sometimes they leave court and didn't really understand what happened. If I advocate for the limited English speaker by explaining something, by asking for permission to lower the register, by making my interpretation more understandable, I'm giving that person actually an unfair advantage as opposed to a normal, ordinary English speaker, right? So to explain this a little bit more, to put it in simple words, the interpreter's task is not to ensure that the defendant understands the proceedings. I know that's crazy because you're like, hey, I'm an interpreter. That's what I do. I'm there to make sure the guy understands. We have to clarify this up front. That's not true. We're not there to make sure that the person understands. We're there to make sure that the person has an equal opportunity to participate in the proceeding, just like any native English speaker would have. That's really as far as we can go with the services that we provide, because I can't really change what's going on in this person's head. I can't really know that. I can't advocate on behalf of this person if I think that he or she doesn't understand. There are other people in the court that are tasked with that. The interpreter's job is very difficult in and of itself. Say what's said, no more, no less. Give that person an opportunity to participate. And look, in the end, sometimes this is what happens. A non-English speaker should be able to understand only as much of the message as an English speaker with the same level of education and intelligence. And if it comes out that we finished the proceeding and the person didn't quite understand, and assuming that I have interpreted correctly, I said all the right things with the right tone and the right register, nobody else in the courtroom intervened, they didn't explain anything additionally, and the guy just sort of left with not fully understanding what happened, well, I did my job. I did my job very, very well. There's a line between the services we provide as court interpreters and advocacy. We can never cross into advocacy in the work that we do, although you will be tempted to do so. It would be easy to do so maybe without anybody realizing it, at least for a little while. We have to be careful to stay on this side of the line. If we start advocating, we become something that's not a court interpreter, right? So I want you to remember that you as a court interpreter, you are a resource that the court uses, the judge and court personnel use, the court system uses maybe in general, to communicate directly with people with limited English proficiency and vice versa, right? There's two-way communication there. Beyond that though, beyond being that mechanism through which communication flows, we really have no role in the proceeding. For all practical purposes, we're not there, right? I'm not really there participating. You're not really a participant for the record, but you are a resource. You are a mechanism. I don't like to use the word tool, but we're sort of an important tool in the judge's tool belt that is used so that we can facilitate communication. But that's it. We'll talk more about this when we get to ethics, of course, but I think this is important up front. Let's go forward now, talk a little bit about why we have spoken language and sign language interpreters. I'm going to turn it over to Aymara, and let's go through this a little bit. Aymara, go ahead.
Thank you, Joshua. Well, reason number one is due process, of course. The right to be present has been interpreted to mean that the defendant has a right to hear proceedings in a language that he or she understands, thus providing equal footing with an English speaker. So that makes perfect sense. A person who speaks English is there to help also with his or her defense, help their attorney, and they obviously understand at least the words. The person who is of limited English proficiency has the same right to be there, to understand what is at a minimum being said, if not the concept per se, but just like an English speaker would be able to turn around and say to their lawyer, if they have it, what was that? What did that mean? The person who does not speak English or doesn't speak it fluently enough should have the same footing as an English speaker. Why do we have spoken language interpreters? Every criminal defendant has the right to aid in his or her own defense. I had mentioned that. I guess I jumped ahead. A person of limited English proficiency cannot communicate effectively with their attorney unless they have an interpreter. And we're going to talk about that also as far as the role of the interpreter, the sworn proceedings interpreter, when we get to ethics. This is very interesting. It also causes a lot of puzzling, I think, sometimes for interpreters because you want to help, you want to be useful, but there are some lines that should not be crossed. For the time being, we're sticking to sworn proceedings, and that's what we're going to do. Reason number 3, Title VI, as interpreted by an executive order, mandates that linguistic access should be made available for any recipient of federal funds. So if an organization is receiving federal funds from the federal government to operate, they must provide language access to the people that receive those services. And we give you the link here. If you are interested in reading that, you can. In this case, some court systems receive federal funds to operate, and they are obligated to provide language access to the people that appear in those courts. So interpreters for the deaf, the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990, which was also amended in 2008, guarantees access for those individuals with disabilities. Much like a person of limited English proficiency, an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing, not necessarily fully deaf, hard of hearing, they have the right to also understand or have access to what is going on, not also to receive the message, but to be able to express themselves through a medium, which in this case is a sign language interpreter. So what is the difference between interpretation and translation? Interpretation always deals with transferring meaning from one language to another via the spoken word. It's entirely oral and generally done on the fly. And it is the mostly performed from English into another language in the United States. Obviously, court proceedings happen in English. And you have defendants or participants that do not speak English or are not fluent enough to be able to express themselves or to understand. And that's what the interpreter comes in. This is like Joshua said, it's an art, not necessarily a science. And it happens right there. Mistakes happen. You just have to play with it, go with the flow, and it comes little by little. You will get good at it, but it's on the fly, unlike translation, which is generally in writing, but it will give you more time to revise your work over and over, before you present a draft. And meaning is what matters most. Always, always, always. It doesn't make sense to repeat, let's say, a made phrase or an expression that comes from one language into another if the person is not going to be able to understand it. For example, in my native language, it rains buckets. In English, it rains cats and dogs. If the judge said or the participant said it was raining cats and dogs, and that's why I didn't see the light when it changed, and I say that in my native language, it's not going to make any sense to the person who is listening to me. So you have to find the meaning, not necessarily a repetition of word for word what is said in the other language. And it goes back also when you're speaking from your native language into English, which is what goes on the record. You got to find the English meaning of that expression or of whatever was said, conveyed in a way that sounds as natural as possible. So translation, dealing with transferring meaning, but via the written word. There is always some kind of text. And like I said, it allows for more time to study the text in question, and meaning is paramount, but you also have to work with the structure of the text. And now you have to pay more attention to the grammar. and put things properly, and it gives you time to think about it over and over. So it's, in a way, I find it easier to do. But other things come into play, because when you get some translation work, you generally do not have access to the person who drafted the original. You're lucky if you're actually translating for somebody who is available to you. In other cases, it could be some document from another country, and it's just handed to you, and you don't know. You got to do the best you can from the meaning of that document that you gather from reading it.
Nice, thank you so much. All right, Marta, let's talk a little bit about bilingualism. We mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we needed to define a little bit or clarify perhaps in a little bit more detail the level of bilingualism needed. Actually, in another presentation, we'll talk a whole lot about bilingualism, but I think at least at this early stage, it's important to ask a couple of important questions here, crucial questions, to make sure that we're all on the same page. So is being bilingual enough? And of course, when we talk about bilingualism, we talk about just the ability to speak two languages. In my case, I speak English and Spanish. So does Armada. We speak English and Spanish. If I have no other training, if I have no other specific education, is that in and of itself enough to be a court interpreter? Huh? What do you guys think? Is it enough to just speak two languages? And maybe specifically, can any bilingual individual be a court interpreter? Also to this, perhaps we could ask, why does it matter who interprets as long as the person using the interpreter understands? These are important questions that I think we need to address up front. So number one, is it enough to just speak two languages? Can any bilingual individual be a court interpreter? Well, certainly if we talk about language in general and the ability to speak two languages, the skill of speaking two languages, right? That is definitely the very basic building block of court interpreting. You obviously have to have that. So is it enough in and of itself? No. But is it crucial? Yes, of course. I imagine everyone listening to this is to some degree bilingual. Now we'll talk more about how bilingual you need to be, because not all bilinguals are created equally, right? We understand that. But having said that, that is certainly an important building block. That's the basic thing. You sort of come to the table with that, and then we go from there. But could any bilingual individual be a court interpreter? My experience tells me no. And I sort of use this analogy to assist in making the point. So bilingual individuals, you got the two languages. I got English and Spanish in my case. Can I be a court interpreter? Well, what if I wanted to be a concert pianist, right? I love the piano. I love listening to classical music. I mean, the only skill that really pianists have to have, I guess, would be that they need two hands, right? I mean, I've got the basic building blocks, the basic tools for becoming a concert pianist. I've got these two hands. Therefore, can I be a concert pianist? Not quite. Maybe any of you have ever studied music know that that's not true, because there's all kinds of other things that go into that. There's talent, and there's hard work and practice, and there's education, and there's study, and there's development. All these things go into it. And even with all of those things, sometimes maybe people don't quite make it as a concert pianist. Same thing in court interpreting. It requires a very high level of skill, even beyond just direct bilingual skills, right? Your direct language skills. Those are building blocks, just like these two hands are building blocks. Okay, I need those. That's my foot in the door, but that's not going to cut it. Now, if we ask, why does it matter who interprets, as long as the person using the interpreter understands? This goes along with our ethical discussion that we'll have a couple of presentations from now. So we'll get more into this later. But just off the top of your head, take a second to think about it. Why does it matter? Why does the interpreter need to be certified? Why does the interpreter need to have special training? Why can't any bilingual person just interpret? I mean, maybe they didn't say it quite right, but the defendant understood, right? The person with limited English proficiency seemed to answer appropriately. They understood. Why is it important? Well, think about what's riding on our interpretation. It's not like we're at Walmart and somebody asks, how much is this dress? Oh, it's $7. Okay. He says it's $7. Do you want it? Yeah, I want it. Okay, let's go ahead and buy it. Low stakes, very low stakes. What's the worst that could happen? Well, the person doesn't buy the $7 dress. Okay. In court, we have that same thing playing out. Maybe I said most things correctly, but there were some nuances there I didn't quite capture. If that person didn't understand fully, didn't fully participate, really that's more important, I think. If that person weren't able to fully participate, what's the worst that could happen? Well, depending on the type of proceeding, they could lose their freedom, they could lose their life, they could pay huge fines, they could be punished for something that they didn't do. An innocent person could go to jail. Uh, a, a guilty person could go free. All kinds of horrible things can happen if the interpreter wasn't qualified to interpret, right? There's all kinds of issues there. We have to make sure that our interpretation is highly accurate because of the downstream consequences that could occur. Even if the person sort of understands at the time, later on, bad things happen when unqualified interpreters interpret in court. Remember that. That's going to be important up front. So, can any bilingual individual be a court interpreter? I would say no. Those are the basic building blocks, but not everybody can do this for many reasons, and we will define those reasons throughout these presentations, actually. All right, so we've mentioned some of this before. Let's just recap this. What do court interpreters actually do then? We defined it, we talked a little bit about it, but what do they do? How can I frame this? How can I understand this? What is my reference point for understanding the work of the court interpreter? Well, we might say that court interpreters serve as a vehicle through which information flows after being transferred from one language to another. Remember the examples we gave before? I'm hearing it in one language, and I'm sort of spitting it out in the other language. There's this mechanism, right? I'm a resource for the court. It's coming through and going out, and it's this constant process of transitioning language from one to the other, of course. You can think of the work as a court interpreter as being an instrument through which the judicial system is able to interact with individuals with limited English proficiency. Without us, honestly, the whole judicial process would grind to a halt. And sometimes in court, I think people take for granted the importance of the court interpreter. It's obvious that the judge is important, that the attorneys are important. The participants themselves, the defendant, the victim, they have to be there. But try doing something when those defendants and victims speak another language and you don't have an interpreter. Let's see how far you get in that process. Everything grinds to a halt. You just can't go forward. So in some respects, the court interpreter is as important, if not more important, than other people's in the courtroom, other people there, just because nothing can really happen if we're not present. You can think about the court interpreter as a magic telephone. What do I mean by this? Well, it's sort of like we said before. I pick up the phone. Here's my handy dandy smartphone. You guys got one of these. All right, so I pick up the phone and I'm talking in English, right? I'm saying everything in English, and the person who's on the other end of this happens to hear that message in the foreign language, right? So it's this magic telephone. I speak in one language, and whoever's listening on the other side hears it in another language. Well, that's what we do as well, right? So we hear it in English, and the person who is receiving the benefit of my interpreting services will hear it in the foreign language, or vice versa. That person is speaking in the foreign language, I'm hearing it in that foreign language, and everyone else in the courtroom who speaks English hears it in English. I don't change any of the content, right? So if the information is flowing through the magic telephone, it's just changing the language. There's no filter. It doesn't lower the register, doesn't omit any of the information. All of that is still there. It just magically changes the language from one to the other. But we mentioned something before that I want to clarify as well. We talk about the direction that we're going from foreign language into English, from English into the foreign language. And so what we can really talk about here, we have the source language, which is the original language that is spoken. And so if I'm in court and they're speaking English, the source language, the original language of the message is English, right? That's the source language. And then there's a target language. That's the language you're working into. These are linguistic terms, but I think it's important to mention them now. We'll talk about them a little more. So in my case, when I'm hearing English, that's the source language. And when I'm interpreting, let's say I'm interpreting simultaneously. Oh, we'll talk more about that in a minute. When I'm interpreting simultaneously, my target language is Spanish. Source language English, target language I'm going into Spanish. That could change for me depending on who's speaking. Sometimes my source language is Spanish, target language is English. Make sure you understand these concepts because we'll sort of throw them around a little bit later, okay? So a couple of questions for you. as we're working toward the end of this presentation, um, given the legal foundation for our profession, is advocacy a part of our job? Why or why not? Well, let me define this for you. And hypothetical, theoretical question, I want you to think about it. So if I see that something in court, maybe I don't agree with the judge's decision. Maybe it's not fair. Maybe I think the judge didn't consider the information presented in making the final ruling. Can I advocate on behalf of that defendant to clarify? Can I advocate and add more information? Can I advocate and explain some cultural issue, some cultural tradition that probably caused this misunderstanding that maybe the judge doesn't understand? Can I advocate? If I see that the person doesn't understand, as we mentioned before, I said everything right. All the concepts were there. My register and tone were appropriate, but the person just didn't understand. Can I advocate? Can I tell the judge he doesn't understand? Can I lower the register? Can I try to assist by adding additional explanations? Can I advocate in that way? If the person is not does not have sufficient funds to hire an attorney, and the judge also refuses to give that person a public defender, right? And so the answer was no. You're just gonna get your own attorney. I don't care. You're telling me you got enough money. You don't have enough money to do it, but I don't care. Can I advocate? Can I say, well, Judge, that's not fair. Judge, I think just because this guy's an immigrant, I think that you're discriminating. Can I do that? Is advocacy a part of our job? It is not. Be very careful here. If you're getting into court interpreting because you want to help people, well, you will help them, but maybe not in the direct way that you're thinking. Think of yourself again as a resource through which information flows in court. Everyone has a specific role to play in a judicial proceeding. You must know what your role is, and you must maintain your work within the very limited parameters of court interpreting. Can you be an advocate and be a court interpreter? Not at the same time. You may do some advocacy later outside of court. Maybe that could work, but not when you're court interpreting. Definitely not. Can our interpretation affect the outcome of a proceeding? Um, if I make a mistake, could it change the way that things turn out? What do you think? Absolutely, it could. That's why, remember we talked about before, why does it matter who's interpreting as long as the person understands? Well, this is why, because we can greatly affect the outcome of a proceeding with our interpretation. And that change can be positive or can be negative for the defendant, for the limited English speaker. If we're not careful, really something very unfair could happen. There may be many times when we don't agree with the final decision. As interpreters, we're not supposed to have opinions, but we're human. So we're watching it and we're like, I would have done it differently. I don't really agree with what that judge did. I don't even like that judge. Maybe you think some of these things. But as long as the judge got the right information, as long as the jury heard the right information, they perceived the defendant, they perceived the speakers of limited English proficiency the right way, even if you don't agree with the decision is fair. The decision is just because it went through our judicial system. It went through the process the right way, and you helped that. You may not agree with the outcome, but the outcome was fair because it was the right outcome based on the whole process. And that process took place because you did your job well. If you don't do it well, could you change that outcome for better or worse? Yes, you could. Must be very careful. Probably the cardinal sin of court interpreting is influencing the decision, influencing the judge, influencing the jury, doing something that ultimately changes the outcome. Very bad. All right, very bad. Let's don't do that. Is it our job to make sure the LEP individual understands every word that's said? It's hard, especially when you're starting out. You want to help. You know that you can help. You know that you can say it in a way that'll help them understand. You feel bad for the guy. You feel bad for this lady, right? Can you ensure that they understand? You cannot. Remember that we work in what's called an adversarial system. It means everybody's against everybody, right? There are some neutral parties in the courtroom, right? But you have a defense. Remember we talked about the defense attorney? That's the person who represents the defendant. They have a very specific goal, has a very specific job. And then you have the prosecutor. The prosecutor sort of represents the state or the county. They also have a very specific job. They're accusing this defendant of committing this crime. So they're against each other. It's adversarial, right? And in the end, the interpreter, where do I line up? Do I line up with the defendant? Do I line up with the prosecutor? No, I don't. I line up with the judge. The judge is impartial. I am impartial, and I must work to maintain that impartiality. And if I go above and beyond to help one side or the other understand something that wasn't explicitly stated in court, then I'm advocating. I have to be very careful. I'm crossing that line into advocacy. Wouldn't be appropriate. Bad things happen to interpreters who advocate, who change roles, who forget about their ethics and try to assist beyond the parameters of their function, their job function in court. Keep this in mind. So is it my job to make sure they understand? No, I can't. I don't know what's going on in their head. Because it's an adversarial role, they have to speak up. They have to speak up if they don't understand. That's their job, that's their obligation. And if they don't, hopefully their attorney does. And if the attorney doesn't, I have no role there. I can't. All right, so let's talk about it. I want you guys to think about it to yourselves. What is the main goal of court interpreting? What is it? Let's think about it. I'm going to sort of walk through some possibilities here for us. Okay, main goal. Main goal, is it to be accurate and complete? We talked about accuracy a lot. Well, that's certainly important. Is that my main goal? Not really. I need that. That is a secondary goal. It's an objective, of course, but is that the main goal? No. Is it to ensure that the participant, the LEP participant, has equal access and equal opportunity to participate in the proceeding? Well, I certainly want that. If I do things right and if I focus on my main goal, that will happen by default, but that's not really my main goal in the end. I want that. I want that because of my main goal. So what's the goal then? If it's not being accurate, it's not giving them equal access, what is the goal? Why am I there? Why do you exist? Why are we there in court? What do we want to happen? What we ultimately want is for justice to be served. Many people come into court interpreting thinking, I want to help people. I'm going to interpret accurately. My main goal is just to interpret as well as I possibly can. My main goal is to help this person. My main goal is to help immigrants. My main goal is to help non-English speakers. Those all to some degree happen sort of by default through our work, but that's not really our goal. Those things are very secondary and some of them are questionable. What our main goal is to ensure that information flows appropriately during the judicial process so that what can happen? So that justice can be served, right? If you do your job well, the wheels of justice keep turning. Judges and juries can make the right decision based on your interpretation. Even if you disagree with the outcome, you have done your job well if that system can move forward. When we're not there, as I mentioned before, everything grinds to a halt. Your main goal is to provide services so that ultimately justice can be served. You do that, everybody wins. Everybody wins. And all those secondary things we talk about, they have to happen automatically for that to occur, right? But in the end, what you want is to be a part of this machine that is the judicial system, and you want to make sure that those wheels keep turning so that the right decisions can be made, and so that justice in our country, in our state, in your county can actually take place the way that it was meant to. That's what we want. Keep that in mind. When you think of it that way, it sort of reframes how you approach this job, right? You had something else in mind maybe when you started watching this video. Now we're redefining your goal, changes the way that you think about the work we do, changes the way you interact with the court system. Very important. All right, lastly, guys, real quick before we finish up, let's talk about the 3 modes of interpretation. We will cover these in depth in a later presentation, but I want to mention them. Okay, so when we talk about the modes of interpretation, we're talking about how we actually interpret, what types of interpretation do we provide? And these are the 3 primary ways that we interpret in court. There may be some other things, but these are the ones we're going to focus on. These are also the ones that you will be tested on if you take the certification exam. So we have what's called simultaneous interpretation, which means I hear it in one language and I'm almost simultaneously spitting it out in the other language. So it's coming in English and I'm spitting it out in that foreign language, and it's in real time, right? There's really not too much of a lag. It's not exactly simultaneous because I have to hear it for a little bit, so I'm a couple of seconds behind, but it's pretty close to simultaneous. That's why we call it that. There's consecutive, which is more like a dialogue. So a question is asked, stop. Interpretation, stop. Answer, stop. Interpretation, stop. It's this back and forth. You envision somebody on the witness stand. What is your name? Stop. I interpret. What is your name? Stop. My name is Joshua Elliott. Stop. I interpret. My name is Joshua Elliott. Stop. It's back and forth, right? And then we have sight translation. I might have covered before the difference between interpretation and translation. And I love sight translation because it's sort of a hybrid. There are features that line up very well with interpretation, specifically simultaneous interpretation. And then there are features that line up more with written translation because there is a document involved. Sight translation is they give me a document in court, I take a look at it, and while I'm reading it, I interpret it out loud for the record in the other language. Very challenging. Sounds like it's easier because you got the paper in front of you. Very, very challenging. We'll go into more depth about these in a different presentation, but I at least wanted to plant the seeds now so that you're starting to think about this. Again, these are the things that you will be tested on eventually if you make it through this process, which I know you will. All right, that's all we've got today. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to contact us with questions. At the end of every presentation, we're going to put this in here. Okay, oh, let me go back a little bit. There we are. Contact us with questions. Here's my email. Here's Imarda's email. Imarda, any closing thoughts, final thoughts for the participants today before we end?
No, I think we covered everything pretty well. And then when we go into practice, we will expand on these things, the modes of interpretation and all that. We'll give you some exercises to do some practice things, and you'll get a better idea of what this is like. But keep in mind, like Joshua was saying, going back to the role of an interpreter is very important. The wheels of justice cannot turn without what we do. But there is a role that is very well defined, and there are lines that are not to be crossed. We're not there to advocate. That's what victims advocates, for example, are. There are positions such as that at the public defender's office, and you're not there to defend anybody. That's what the attorneys are for. So be very mindful of those lines. And again, if you have any questions, write to us at either one of those email addresses.
And a question for you, Marta, actually, as we talk about this in those lines, when you're starting off as an interpreter, it can be very difficult to know where those lines are and to maintain yourself on one side or the other of the line. That's hard in the best of cases. I've seen that people from other professions that come into court interpreting sometimes have even more challenges. And yourself having training as an attorney, which is obviously a very strong advocacy role. Have you ever had difficulties, separating those two? At first, was it difficult for you? How has that over time sort of played out?
Well, the reality is that for me, going from practicing law to interpreting was a relief in a way. I was actually very happy to stop giving people legal advice and telling them what to do. So I don't miss that. But there are situations in which you find that an interpreter is a helpful person by nature. And I have found in the 6 or 7 years I've been doing this that we all love it. We love what we do, and we're helpful people in general. There are some times in which what the person is not understanding is so simple, be it because they do not come from this country or their level of education. And the temptation is such to put it in simpler language or to say, no, this is what you have to do. You have to refrain yourself. And it comes with time. I was part of conversations sometimes in which I could tell that, modesty aside, I could do a better job at explaining a concept than the lawyer was doing or was happening in the courtroom, but it was not my role. I understand there was a situation, for example, in which the attorney was explaining to the person something about the period to file a case. And the person wasn't understanding it because they have no idea what this concept of you have this many days to file a case and otherwise that's it. And I could have put it in simpler terms, but you know what? It's not my job. This is the attorney that is hired to do this. So, just step aside, think about what you're doing, what your role is, and eventually some of these things tend to work themselves out. Eventually, it's like the who's on first base type of thing, So it will work itself out eventually. People will understand if you give them enough time. The participants in the legal system, they will figure out that the LEP may not necessarily be understanding what is going on, and it is for the attorney to work that out and to help there, not for the interpreter.
Very interesting. I am not an attorney, but what she's describing, I think all interpreters will face that. I've interpreted these things enough times to know that sometimes I could do a better job of explaining. But like she's saying, as the interpreter, that's not our role, and you let things play it out. And I think that's a great way to end today's session. You know, a good interpreter will ultimately let a situation work itself out. You focus on what you're doing, focus on the linguistics, focus on maintaining your ethics within the parameters established, and really these things will work themselves out, right? One way or another, it will work itself out. Perfect. Well, thank you guys for being here. We'll see you next time with our next presentation. Take care.